Hi everyone, so welcome back. Now in this video, we're going to take a dive into budget performance reports. Now a budget performance report reports and summarizes actual costs, standard costs, and the differences between the two. And it's what's important to maybe make sure we understand that it's based on actual production. Okay, so anytime there's a difference between actual and standard, that is called a cost variance. Now it could be favorable or unfavorable, but anytime there's a difference, it's called a cost variance. So in the first one we have here is when there's a when actual cost is less than standard cost, that would be considered a favorable variance, which means you spent less than what the standard said, right? So just think about when maybe you have a budget when you go to the grocery store, right? Maybe your budget a week is $50 or something like that. If you go to the grocery store and you spend $45, then you have a favorable variance. You spent less than what you intended to spend, okay? All right, and now in this one, when actual cost is greater than standard cost, that would be considered an unfavorable variance, meaning you spent more than what you budgeted for, okay? And that will be, again, considered an unfavorable variance. Now, I want to continue with the example that we were doing before with the extra large jeans, just to show you how this all plays out. Okay, so here we have the extra large jeans that are produced and sold. So we're talking about a quantity of 5,000 pairs. The actual cost that was incurred in June for direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead is given, is given here, okay? But let's not forget that when we're looking at a budget, or when we're looking at a budget performance report, we're doing a comparison between budgeted versus actual, right? So that's what we're going to get into next. This is what actually happened, but let's look at what should have happened for a budget of 5,000 pairs of jeans, okay? All right. So on this screen, it now shows us that, hey, this is our actual versus a budget for these extra large jeans. And now we're doing the actual comparison. So what we have here is all of our manufacturing costs, which is our direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. These are our actual costs that we experience in the manufacturing process. This column shows what the budget, when we set out at the beginning of the year and created standards, so forth and so on, this was our standard cost at this particular volume, okay? And then the very last column does the comparison for us. It looks at actual costs, and then it looks at the standard cost for that same volume, and then it does that comparison, and the difference will be our cost variance, whether that's favorable or unfavorable. So let's take the first one for example. Our direct materials, our actual cost was $40,150. Our standard costs calls for $37,500 in direct material. And looking at these two numbers, what I can tell you is that we have an unfavorable variance. And it's unfavorable because we're supposed to spend only $37,500. However, we spent above and beyond what our budget called for. Therefore, we have a $2,650 unfavorable variance. Now, what's important to also recognize here is that unfavorable variances will be positive numbers and favorable variances will be negative, okay? All right, so let's quickly go through direct labor. The same thing could be for direct labor. Our direct labor actual cost was $38,500. Our standard called for $36,000. So again, we went over budget, over our direct labor budget by $2,500, which is another unfavorable variance. Next, last but not least, we have factory overhead. Just as a reminder, factory overhead includes the supervisor, utilities, property taxes, depreciation, so forth and so on. Our actual cost for factory overhead was $22,400, and our standard called for $24,000. So therefore, we have a favorable variance because the standard is more than what we actually spent. We have a favorable variance of $1,600, which is denoted here. And as I mentioned before, favorable variances are negative. Okay. All right. So let's continue. So just as a reminder, how did we come up with this? So in the prior video, I showed you how we, for one pair of extra large jeans, this should have been the rate for it, right? And I think it came out to like $19 and something cents. And so what we're doing is taking the 5,000 pairs in question, and we're multiplying it times all of our manufacturing costs in regards to direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Oh, there it goes. So yeah, the 1950, that's what we talked about in the very first video. Okay, so all of this comes from there. Okay. All right, so overall, in looking here, I know I have a lot of marks here, but what I want to make sure we understand is overall, when we're looking at our total manufacturing costs, we have a total unfavorable variance of $3,550, right? So we have unfavorable here, and then we have a favorable here. But overall, it would be considered an unfavorable variance, okay? All right, so let's talk about manufacturing cost variances. So total manufacturing cost variance is when we have total actual cost of each unit produced minus the total standard cost. Okay, so what does that look like? Here. So it says each product cost variance with direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead is separated into two additional variances. So again, this first chart is what we saw on a prior slide, and I was showing or talking about our variances. And so as I mentioned again, our total manufacturing cost variance is $3,550. Okay, but what we're saying in the next point I mentioned before is that all of our product costs, as in direct materials, our direct materials, our direct labor costs, and our factory overhead is further subdivided into direct material price, quantity, so forth and so on. So in the slides to come, we're going to take a deeper dive into each of the direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead variances. And then we're going to maybe try to explain how and why and from what departments is these variances coming from, okay? But before we go into that, when I was in corporate America or industry, this is maybe one of the typical jobs of an accountant. So if you ever want to take a dive into an accountant's job, explaining variances for companies is probably, again, one of the primary roles and responsibilities of an accountant. So while $3,550 doesn't seem like a lot, let's imagine it's 3 million, right? Now that makes a difference, right? Because it's a bigger dollar value. But so say for instance, your manager comes to you or would come to me and say, hey, Dana, you have a variance, or we have a variance of $3,550,000. Can you help explain why we have such a large variance? And so being an employee that I am gonna be able to pull up all of our information through our system and try to explain this variance. And in doing so, I can quickly maybe tell my manager or whoever, oh, what's causing this variance is we have a $2.6 million variance in direct materials, 2.5 unfavorable variance in direct labor, and then we have a $1.6 million variance in our factory overhead. Now, what's important here is usually when there's a favorable variance, say for a factory overhead, anytime there's a favorable variance, Managers typically don't look into that because they're like, oh, I saved money, no big deal, right? But if it starts to happen time and time again, then that's when it's probably worth revising. But most times, managers will focus their attentions on unfavorable variances where we missed the mark, right? And so I tell my manager, hey, our unfavorable variances is coming from direct materials and direct labor. Now, that's great, but if I'm a manager, I want to know, okay, I hear you in what you're saying that direct materials is causing our unfavorable variance, but why? Right? You have to be able to tell a narrative as to why we have a $2.6 million variance. And studying these two other variances will allow you to begin to create a narrative around why you have a variance in your direct materials and direct labor. It gives you more detail, more insight, and that's what they're really paying you for, is that detail and that insight. Okay. All right, so the first one we're going to study again is total direct materials variance, and then we're going to get into all the other ones. So with that, I'm going to stop this video and start a new video talking all about direct material variances and what could be the